I'm Carl Bernstein, and I'm speaking freely.
What this is all about is your right to freedom of speech.
What made America great is an independent, vigorous press.
If a jerk burns a flag, America is not threatened.
Political speech is the heart of the First Amendment.
For expressing their religious beliefs.
Now is the time to make justice a reality for all of God's children.
Welcome to Speaking Freely, a weekly conversation about free expression in America. I'm Ken Paulson. Our guest today is one of America's best-known journalists and authors, Carl Bernstein. Great to have you here.
Good to be here.
You know, I've read quite a bit about you, and there's been a great deal written. What I've enjoyed reading particularly is the descriptions of Woodward and Bernstein, who they are in the history of journalism. And one of my favorites, especially considering some of your rock critic roots, is the city paper in Washington described you as the Lennon and McCartney of journalism. Would that make you Paul or John?
Interesting. I think John.
That's a good choice. Are you surprised that I mean, it was an extraordinary story, tremendous impact, obviously, but 30 years on, it is absolutely what you are best known for, and it's what people want to talk to you about. Has it surprised you, the staying power of that whole episode?
Not really. I think that its impact was so huge on the country that understandably people want to talk about it. It's an experience that seared the national consciousness. And it continues to reverberate because these tapes of Nixon's keep coming out that show that it was even worse than we thought at the time. So that obviously people want to talk about it.
You know, it's kind of a mixed bag. You argue, and you've written forcefully about the need for journalism of substance, and yet 30 years on, you get asked about Deep Throat on every one of these shows. If you were a young journalist today, is that a story you would chase? Do you think there's any importance today in knowing who Deep Throat is?
Yeah, I think it's a legitimate story because I think it's of real historic importance in terms of understanding part of the story itself and in terms of understanding the journalism of it. So I think it's a legitimate story, and we are going to reveal his identity upon the death of the individual known as Deep Throat.
Can you think of another story where the source has become as big as the story?
No, probably not. But the whole Watergate experience, both journalistically and in terms of the country, is sui generis, and that's one more example of it. I mean, one of the things about the journalism of Watergate is that it's the only episode in our history nationally in terms of the White House where really what we know, largely we know not from documents within the White House, but we know from outside through journalism to a large extent.
We compared notes a little earlier, and we are both of an era in which there were actually typewriters.
Yes.
in newsrooms. And saw the rolling in of those cathode ray terminals.
I actually did not. I had left the Washington Post by the time of the first. They were still using typewriters when I left in '77.
I was tempted to leave when they rolled those computer terminals in. And you started at a remarkably young age, 16.
16 at the Washington Star.
And you had to have a romantic sense of the business. Weren't you just excited to be walking into a newsroom at age 16?
Oh, I mean, I think the most indelible day of my life is the day I first walked into the newsroom of the Washington Star, which was a huge bullpen with about 100-something reporters and their typewriters clacking and people yelling copy and straight out of the front page, and I grew up in that newsroom. I worked there for 4 years, and it was like a family, and it was a great newspaper. It was a better newspaper than the Washington Post at the time. This was 1960, and the beginning of the Kennedy years.
What did they see in this 16-year-old? I know there's always room for copy boys and rewrite kids.
I could type. Actually, it's really true. The smartest thing I ever did in my life is I got sick of taking shop with the boys, so I took typing with the girls. And
that opened it up, huh?
No, actually, I think they did see some talent that I had, and one of the great things about the Star was they nurtured young people. And even though I was a few years younger than the next youngest, they let me cover things gradually, and I became a dictationist, meaning that I sat with a headset on and took the dictation of reporters calling in their stories, and including David Broder's story from Dallas.
Oh, you have to talk about that.
I remember it indelibly. I mean, David dictated, 2 priests walked out of Dallas Memorial Parkland Hospital at 2:34 p.m. today and announced, quote, "The president is dead."
You had to be trembling.
I was, and I misspelled hospital.
Oh.
My hands were shaking so much.
An entire generation.
And then I went up to Capitol Hill to try and find. They sent me up to Capitol Hill to try and find Speaker McCormick, who of course was the next in line, and he was down under some desk, hiding. You know, they didn't know if it was a conspiracy. They didn't know.
And there are truly moments in a newsroom where you feel like you are at the center of the universe, or whatever is happening in it, and it's a very special feeling. There's a generation that I suppose saw All the President's Men and decided that this was a pretty glamorous profession. But in 1960, there were other journalists depicted in other ways. I mean, Humphrey Bogart in Deadline USA. Did you have a role model? Did you see something that inspired you to be a reporter?
Maybe Izzy Stone, I.F. Stone from I.F. Stone's Weekly, but mainly the people at the Star. There were great reporters at the Star. This was a great newspaper. At the time, the Washington Post had, deservedly so, a reputation to some extent for slanting stories, and it did, particularly in its local coverage. And the Star really had the best of old-fashioned journalistic play-it-straight values. And it had some great reporters, as well as some real characters straight out of the front page.
They've outlawed characters now in newsrooms.
Yes, there are no longer characters
They're not
allowed
permitted.
in newsrooms. Absolutely, they have rugs in newsrooms right now.
There's no smoking, no drinking, and no cussing. So from that beginning, what an extraordinary beginning, because you saw America's newsrooms as at their most vibrant, really.
No, when I went to work at the Washington Post, I thought I was going to work for an insurance company.
By comparison.
I really did.
Yeah. And your career moved pretty quickly. I mean, you had a head start like very few people have had. Did the Post recruit you?
No, not at all, because I have no college degree.
I see.
And so I was the only reporter, I think, at the Post with no college degree, or maybe there was one other who was about 65 years old or something. And between the Post and the Star, I went to work in New Jersey for a small paper, the Elizabeth Journal, in a terrible town. But it was a great experience. I was there for a little over a year, and I was able to do everything that you can do in a newspaper. And on the strength of that, and the fact that the Post knew me from the Star, they hired me despite the absence of a college degree.
This show is about the First Amendment, and I'm really pleased to be able to talk to you about the state of free press. But I have to tell you, I really enjoyed another publication about the First Amendment, your book, Loyalties, about your parents' experience during the McCarthy era. Your mother ended up having to take the Fifth Amendment. She was a civil rights activist, fought for integration of lunch counters, I guess, in Washington, D.C., and your father was a union organizer,
right,
active in the labor movement. Did that kind of environment, a very idealistic environment, drive your impulse to be a journalist at all?
I don't think it drove my impulse to be a journalist. I think it has informed my beliefs about what is important in terms of the country and in terms of particularly the First Amendment. But my father did, I think the most significant thing in his working life that he did is he defended people who had been accused of disloyalty to the government before these draconian loyalty review boards that had been established during the Truman administration, which really was the first overt active McCarthyism in our history. And I mean, it goes right to the question of the First Amendment and that of free speech and of free association. And he won most of those cases, although the lives of most of those people were already ruined by having been accused of disloyalty. And obviously, it's a term that reverberates today.
Every young man or woman at times, questions what their parents do for a living. Did you ever just go, Mom, Dad, can't you just do something that doesn't lead
Sure.
the FBI?
Oh, no, absolutely. No, I rebelled against it. I mean, I did not like the fact that my parents were of the left. There was a period there that I didn't like it at all, and I was pretty rebellious about it.
How could they explain to you as a young man what they were going through?
I don't think they did too much, except the one thing that I think was really inculcated was the notion of racial struggle. That whatever their politics were, and I incidentally do not subscribe to a lot of their politics, or certainly their ideology. But I think there was a commitment to racial justice that they and other people of the left had, particularly in Washington, which was a segregated town. I went to segregated public schools in the capital of the United States until the Supreme Court decision in Brown versus Board of Education, and the companion case was a District of Columbia public schools case. So I went with my mother, and I was on a lot of those picket lines as a kid, and with black kids, and I knew black kids as a child. And so I think that they explained a lot of it in terms of racial justice. And I think there was a lot about people on the left in the United States generally in that era, including members of the Communist Party, who whatever their misguided beliefs about the nature of the Soviet Union, and their belief that the Soviet Union was going to be some kind of miraculous place of economic parity, they certainly believed in a kind of racial equality in this country that the Democratic Party and the Republican Party did not believe in at the time. Remember, the Democratic Party at the time was largely controlled by Southern congressmen.
You're at the time you were doing publicity for the book Loyalties, and you were asked then whether McCarthyism could rear its head again, and you said, no, not in the same way. 10 years later, a little over 10 years later, we're in a period known as the War on Terrorism. Do you still feel like McCarthyism is not likely to rear its head, isn't rearing its head again?
I don't think McCarthyism is rearing its head. I think, though, that there is a complacency about the incursion of civil liberties and civil rights that is very disturbing, that as can easily happen in a period of either national emergency or perceived national emergency. There is an appeal to the patriotic nature of our people, in which if you have a leader or leaders who do not care or who are not cognizant of the great danger of incursion of civil liberties, that then you run some real problems.
Well, you are a little bit more free to speak out now that you write books for a living and are working at a daily newspaper.
True.
You've written and spoken about the Watergate era and particularly its impact on the news media. And you've said that in the wake of Watergate there was a frenzy of self-congratulation and also defensiveness. And there are a lot of factors involved in that. And one of the turning points was the Nixon White House and the way it responded to the press. Spiro Agnew was on the attack. They made the press the issue successfully.
The conduct of the press became the issue rather than the conduct of the President of the United States.
Why was that such an effective strategy?
Because it works. Because it appeals, again, that unless until things become really hairy in this country, people identify with criticism of the press, and usually for some pretty good reasons. We don't do our job. We're like doctors. You go to a doctor's office, and 10% of the doctors in this country are great, and they're going to save your life. Another 20% of them, you might be a little better off by the time you leave the office. Another 20%, you're about the same. 30% a little worse. 20% of them, you'll be in pretty rough shape. 10% of them will kill you. I'm not at all sure that we're different.
No, people want their children to marry doctors.
Well, that's because they make more money.
That's it.
That has nothing to do with saving lives. But my point is that that when the chips are down and when things are rough, people look to the press. And they believe in the press, and whatever those numbers are, that the press is held in more disregard than carnival operators, or whatever it is at a given moment. I don't worry too much about that, because people, and also if you then ask the next question, which these pollsters never ask, which is, well, how do you know about the things you care about? The answer, of course, is the press. So I don't worry too much about that.
Wasn't there a point, though, in 1960 when you walked in and you're going to be a reporter, that a journalist, a newsman at the time, was kind of a heroic figure? I mean, you look at movies and television of the 50s. When Superman went into civilian garb, he was a newspaper man.
Well, but we never knew a thing about what he did as a reporter. What we knew is he had to put on another suit to do something.
That's right.
So.
But since then, I mean, I think in the wake of Lou Grant, how many heroic figures are there? I mean, there does seem to be some tarnishing of the image of a journalist as somebody who can be heroic and make a difference.
Well, I think that's true. Look, that after Watergate, there was this huge identification with Bob and myself with the idea of these heroic reporters. Exactly, in some ways, if anything should have been taken away from the example of All the President's Men, both the book and especially the movie, it's the non-heroic aspects of it, because it's just about knocking on doors and a lot of shoe leather. I mean, it's not about anything exotic. And it's not about rocket science either.
We had Robert Redford on the show not long ago, and he talked about making the movie All the President's Men, and said one of the things that made him want to do it was it says something very positive about freedom of the press, but that he now has misgivings about freedom of the press. And I suppose this ties into what you've called the idiot culture, this sensationalism. Why are we here? Why has the press moved in that direction?
One, I have no misgivings about freedom of the press. let me say that.
I was counting on that.
Are there excesses? Absolutely. But is it not? There's one thing that makes us different than everybody else in this country, and the whole ball game is the First Amendment.
Yeah. Well,
really.
To be fair to Redford, he wasn't asking for the repeal or rewrite of the First Amendment.
But that's it. I mean, it really is. It's obviously the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, but really it's the first one. And that is the basis of why we have this amazing instrument in this country.
Do you think Americans understand the importance of a free press?
Yeah, I do.
Even when they are assaulted?
I do.
The sensationalism is driven by a lot of things, and ratings, money, and corporations. Could you talk a little bit about what has happened in this nation in terms of the melding of media?
Well, first I think you have to look at things historically, and that is that you've always had yellow journalism in this country, and it's always been a rather important seam in our journalism. But you also have had a mainstream journalism in which the bottom line has been what I call the best obtainable version of the truth. That is no longer the bottom line. The bottom line is now the bottom line. And economics have impinged on what our purpose is. So that even though it is not unreasonable to expect that a newspaper or a television station or anything else should make money, it has now become not about staying in business. It has become about how big those profits are going to be, and that profit margin and the expectation of that profit margin now drives most of our journalistic institutions. The great exceptions, and incidentally, the great exceptions also make pretty good money, which is to say the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Washington Post, etc. They make pretty good money for a lot of different complicated reasons. But they're also, they are our great journalistic resources. And they are, for the most part, better than they've ever been. But then you get to the rest of what's out there, and a lot of it is pretty awful. And at the same time, you also have some very good small newspapers.
I think you make a pretty good case for community newspapers across the country. You said 1960, Post was biased in its local coverage. The Chicago Tribune at one point described itself pretty freely as a Republican newspaper. And you don't see political affiliation. You see, I think, probably more balanced community newspapers than maybe historically they've been.
Well, I've never thought that the big problem of bias, I believe that there is bias in the news media, and I think it's a terrible problem. I don't think that it has to do with liberalism, as the critics say. I think it's geographical. I think there's a huge problem that our publications and our media generally reflects an outlook from the East Coast particularly outward, and a little bit from the West Coast and almost nothing in between. And having spent a lot of time between the two coasts, I know that the reality of this country is very different than that reflected in our media. And it's a terrible problem. We have to do something about it, because it is a form of bias, and it distorts, it creates a context that's not real. It's Washington-centric, it's New York-centric, and that's not what's on people's minds so much. And we need to find a way to start reflecting the reality of the country. So, but back to your question about political bias, I don't think that's ever been a huge problem in the press. Newspapers historically have been owned by Republican families, but the coverage has never reflected it.
We've got more channels, more television channels, more media than ever before, and certainly the internet has opened up all kinds of new opportunities. And yet, on the other hand, the idiot culture you've written about, the sensationalism, gives us a new level of shallowness, I suppose, in some ways. Are Americans better informed today than they were, let's say, during the height of Watergate?
No, but by choice. The ability to be better informed is there. Anybody in this country, because of the web, can be informed in a way they never could have been at the time of Watergate. If you want to find out, today there's a horrible bombing in Israel. You want to find out about what's going on in Israel, go to the Haaretz site, the English language Haaretz site, and find out about that. You want to find out about what's going on in Miami, if there's a hurricane, go to the Miami Herald site. You want to find out great political reporting, go to the Washington Post and the New York Times site. So, the web has made it possible to create your own information network from the best sources in the world. So there is no excuse for anyone saying that they can't be well informed. The problem is people choose not to be, and they continue to get most of their information from particularly television news, which has gotten much worse. And the 22 and a half minutes of the network news every evening, 11 of which is about diets and prescription drugs, as far as I can tell, and et cetera, et cetera. It's a shame what's happened to the network news.
We'll leave the easy question for last. You've worked in journalism for more than 40 years. You had the joy of actually working in a place where the presses roll and your work comes out and still probably wet sheets of paper. Will there be newspapers 50 years down the road? What do you see?
I see newspapers. I see that people are going to still want to carry around something the same way they're going to carry around books. They're not going to read electronic books. There's something about, we like tactile things. Will they be different? Yes, they'll be very different. One, because advertising is going to move away from newspapers. I think it's not a very logical advertising medium anymore, in a lot of respects. They'll change, they'll evolve, but yeah, we'll still have newspapers.
It's been great to have you here.
Thanks, good to be here.
Our guest has been journalist and author Carl Bernstein. Thank you for joining us today on Speaking Freely.
Join us next time as we continue our discussion on free expression and the arts. For more information about Speaking Freely, visit our website at www.speakingfreely.org.